first part of Esther, and we are going to start in chapter 1 and go through the entire chapter today. If we can see if we can actually make it through an entire chapter. I won't always do this, but the way this flows, I wanted to try to condense and do the whole chapter. I'm not going to skip anything important. A lot of the historical background we went over last week in the introduction to Esther. So you can always refer back to that video. I will be repeating some of those little factoids because the people in our story, I'll have to fill you in on some details. Now, we're going to be exposed today to one main character and one minor character who's going to leave the story. But I hope you enjoy this book. Again, it's a very enjoyable book just to sit down and read, but like Ruth, there's so many nuggets in here about God's sovereignty and the fact that he's going to have his way regardless. So why don't I do who's available? Lee, why don't you open us up in prayer this morning before we get started?
Okay. Father, we're so grateful to you. You are so good to us. It's so easy for us to look around us in our nation and in the world and wonder if you're still there sometimes, but then we see evidence that you definitely are. And we're so grateful that you are a good God, that your word is infallible, that anything we read in your word is going to be true and will come true. Mm-hmm. And we thank you for that. Thank you for Lynn, who studies so diligently and prepares these sessions for us. It just makes it so enjoyable to learn. Mm-hmm. We ask you to bless this session today. Just help us to retain everything that we hear today. Yeah. Amen. We thank you for providing a place for Marty and for answering that prayer. You're so attentive to our needs, Lord. Ask you to bless Lynn as he teaches us today and just help us to be good listeners and good retainers of all that we learn. And we just thank you and praise you for it. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Hey, Dan, as an aside, have you talked to Ken, or do you have any updates concerning Ken?
He started speech therapy. We'll be going regularly with that, and they're still waiting to set up where he gets the shots in his vocal cords. I'm taking them, him and Rosie, over to the train station tomorrow to go to North Carolina for a couple of weeks. So I'll be talking more with them tomorrow.
Okay.
His voice is getting better.
All right. Well, guys, continue to pray for Ken, and Dan, if you'd pass on our well wishes to him tomorrow when you see him, that would be great.
I will do that.
Esther, go ahead and turn to chapter 1. Esther is the last of the historical books in the Bible. There's prophetic books and then there's books of poetry, but this is the last of the historical books, and its main character, named Esther, her name actually, her Persian equivalent of her name means Venus, or the morning star. And you'll see some reasons for that. It's funny how the names always seem to match up with what they were destined to be or destined to become. But the deeds of Esther cast a very bright light forward into the history of Israel, because we're just about ready to enter that 400-year period of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament when this was written. Let's begin. I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2 to get you launched off. So if you'll read with me, I'm in the New King James Version, but flows pretty well in all your different versions. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Remember, this is the same guy in Greek they would be called Xerxes. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, and this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel or the capital. Shushan is the Hebrew, since this is written from a Hebrew perspective, the Persians called that capital city Susa. Now, King Ahasuerus is well known to history, not only biblical history, but also extra biblical history, well documented by historians. Obviously, more commonly under the non-Hebrew name, the Greek name Xerxes. He inherited this huge empire, and even in the text, it mentions how big it is. 127 provinces stretched from India to Ethiopia. He inherited the Persian Empire from his father, who's also a famous person in historical documents and in the Bible. His father was Darius I. And Darius I is mentioned in places like Ezra and Daniel and Haggai. And Ahasuerus was well documented. Archaeologists have discovered the ruins of the very palace where this story in Susa is going to be taking place. They know how many columns were in the main colonnade. They know how many arches. They even have fragments of some of these elaborate ornamental decorations that we're going to read about today intact, which I think is pretty interesting. At this point in history, Persia was still the main superpower, but there's a challenger coming up out of the West. And there's going to be a power struggle to control the world. And we already mentioned this before, that would be the up and coming empire of Greece. Xerxes was at pretty much his zenith at this point. He was a successful military ruler. Not really had tasted much in the way of defeat in his history. He had already ended big uprisings and rebellions in both Egypt and in Babylon around 484 BC, a year or two before this was written. These events kind of explain what may be one of the reasons behind the celebration we're going to be reading about. I think the celebration we're going to be reading about in the next verses was probably a twofold purpose, but one of them was to celebrate his successes and his putting down of these various rebellions. So this was around, remember, we're countdown. So this is around 483 BC, somewhere in this time frame. He is planning, and I'm just giving you some historical background. This is not necessarily all contained in your text today, but this is from historical documents from the period. Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, is planning to assert himself over Greece. So he's going to plan this big invasion of Greece west of him. So he's going to march west. Now, this will be occurring several years later, but this brings me into the second reason why I think this big party is being held. I think he's trying to drum up support. I think he's got this big military campaign plan where he's going to crush the Greeks. But in order to do that, he's got to get buy-in from all 127 of his governors, not only financially through the way of taxes, but also, where do you think the manpower from the army's coming from? So he's going to kind of schmooze them, if you will, and try to get their buy-in for this invasion. Plus, again, celebratory and to show off his power and his wealth to impress them, really. Now, Athens at this time, which is the capital of Greece, similar to today, actually, Athens was kind of hitting its cultural zenith. They were already participating in the Olympic Games. I believe I read somewhere this was already their 79th Olympic Games that were being celebrated in Greece. So Greece is no little upstart. They're definitely challengers and competitors to the Persian Empire. At this time, Ezra, in Jewish history, what's going on with the Jews? Ezra, as you'll notice in the book of Ezra, had returned to Jerusalem with some of the stragglers, some of the refugees who did want to go back to Israel, and they are going to rebuild the temple. And it was done roughly 30 years before. Now, this temple wasn't anything like Solomon's temple. This was just a pretty, frankly, a pretty crude temple, but at least they had a temple again. This happened about 30 years prior to when this story was written. And in addition to this, in about 40 years, under Ahasuerus's kid, who would be, instead of called Xerxes, you may have heard of him too, and from your history books, he was Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, during his reign, Nehemiah, another guy that you see in the Bible, close grouping to the book of Esther, Nehemiah is going to go back with another group of refugees to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. So there's already a crude rudimentary temple that's been rebuilt there. And then in about 40 years, there's going to be the start of the construction of the walls around Jerusalem as well. Let's move on to verse 3-9. In the third year of his reign, which helps us with dating this book, in the third year of his reign, this we're talking about Ahasuerus, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast, another party that lasted 7 days for all the peoples who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the gardens of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. Very, very, very opulent, displaying the wealth and the splendor of the Persian Empire. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from one another, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. I'll explain that in a minute. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So there's this huge shindig being thrown in the capital city. And again, I think the purpose of this was twofold. One's to show off pride, but the second was to amass support for his plan. Now, the first feast was strictly for the government officials, these governors and all their supporting entourage, and he's showing them off the glory and the splendor of his kingdom. It was probably unique for these men to travel back to the main capital city and see how much wealth that had been accumulated by their nation. Now, it says the feast lasted 180 days. Most scholars don't believe that party lasted an entirety of 180 days uninterrupted. It took all these people didn't necessarily come in at the same time. It's not like there was public transit back then. As one delegation would come in, they would get the tour. You know, when you get company over to your house, they've never been to your house. What do we give them? We call it the nickel tour, right? So they're getting the nickel tour through the kingdom, and they're being shown all the splendors and the wealth of the capital city. During this same period of time, there is speculation by most of the scholars that read of this account that this is where the beginning planning stages were occurring for this battle against Greece that will be happening in just a few short years. Then after this 180-day period, he then throws a feast for everybody in the capital. And notice it says from great to small. It didn't matter who you were. If you were a resident, and you have to figure the population of the capital city of Persia would be a fairly significant number of people. And for 7 days, they could come and go to this party. And the king laid out the whole spread. This wasn't El Cheapo wine served in a box. This is the king's special wine. And so it's like he pulls out all the stops to schmooze everybody and win the support of the people for this campaign. Now I'm going to take you down a side path. We know what happened with this campaign, not through necessarily the book of Esther, but through history books. This will be, and if you guys are into history, great. If you're not, just you can fall asleep to the next 3 minutes. Paul can take a nap. This is going to be the greatest military campaign in world history up to this point in time. Now, this is kind of mind-boggling. The numbers don't mean as much to us because we live in a world of almost 8 billion people, but there weren't 8 billion people in the world. This guy managed to amass from all 127 provinces in a few years, he's going to amass an army of 2 million men, which is, to me, is just a mind-boggling. There'll be Indians and Turks and Persians and Babylonians and all from all these conquered kingdoms, all parts of these 127 provinces, and they make up this enormous sea of people in order to invade Greece. And they did invade Greece with 2 million men strong. And initially, the army was very successful, and the Greeks could not. The Greeks were great fighters, but they did not have anywhere near those numbers, and they were being steamrolled by the Persian army. However, as the time went on, it took a tremendous toll on the Persian army, and he got as far as a city called Thermopylae in Greece and was stopped. So that's the army. But you have to remember, again, ancient world, you don't think in these terms. Persia had a navy, and the Persian navy was 300 plus vessels, which is a substantial size naval force. And this fleet sailed against the Greeks, and at a port called Salamis, they met head on with the Greek navy, who also had a navy, and the Persian navy was utterly destroyed. They were decimated. There was almost virtually nothing left of the Persian navy. So, but by this time, there was a huge one last battle in a city called Thalmus in Greece, and the Persians were defeated. And they tucked their tail and limped back to Persia. So the Greeks stopped the invasion of their country by the Persians, by Ahasuerus, and roughly 150 years after this was written, there will be a Greek leader that we will know as one of the greatest military leaders in the history of mankind, Alexander the Great. And 150 years later, he will successfully displace Persia as the world superpower. So that was a little sidebar history lesson. What is happening in the book of Esther? This initial foray into Greece is being planned by this very party that we're talking about. These blue and white linen curtains, this is just purples and blues were very difficult for the ancients to manufacture. It was a very laborious process. It spoke of opulence and wealth. Now, the drinking was not compulsory. Again, backstory on Persian drinking rituals. If the king raised his cup, you were obligated to drink with him, or else you'd have to leave the party. It was considered insulting. But he instructed his officials, let each man decide for himself how much. Even the drinking was not compulsory. You can have as much or as little as you want. And while this was going on, the women, Vashti was hosting all the women of Susa and the dignitaries, and she was having her own party for just the gals. So you guys with me so far? All right, verse 10 and 11. Now we're going to have part of what your lesson is going to be about. On the level of stupidity, this is going to be like a 10. Here we go. On the 7th day of that 7-day festival, after 180 days of showboating and parading people around, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded, and I'm going to try on these names, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abictha, Tethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown. And now for what purpose? To introduce her to his drunken friends? Nope. In order to show her beauty to the people and to the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So the first little nugget here that we see, and this guy's tanked. He's been drinking for 7 days. He's not going to make a clear, wise decision. He's drunk. And so he, I got the prettiest gal. Now, Jewish legend, and this is not biblical, so be careful with this. This is not historical. This is just Jewish legendary tale, says that these men were sitting around drinking for 7 days, saying, hey, the women for my provinces are the prettiest. No, mine are the prettiest. No, mine are the prettiest. And Ahasuerus goes, Queen Esther, Queen Vashti, she's the prettiest. I'll show you. And he sends the eunuchs in to go get her. Now, eunuch, in case you don't know, are castrated males. And they were entrusted to be the communique between the king and the harem. They had charge of the harem. They had charge of the wives, because they obviously, there's nothing they could do with them. So many times eunuchs would rise to a high level of prominence in the ancient world because the king trusted them with many, many, many responsibilities. So this guy's drunk. He says to his eunuchs, go in, go get Queen Vashti, tell her to wear her royal crown, and come back and parade herself in front of the rest of these characters. Now, Harbona, we'll come back to. Harbona is going to come back into our story in chapter 7. So that's the only one of these people you need to worry about. The rest of them will drift away from the story. The implication by most scholars is that Vashti was to display herself in a very immodest way. We'll talk about Persian customs in just a minute, but Ahasuerus is drunk and he's going to settle the issue because he's got a knockout for a wife, and he's calling her in to show herself off before the boys. A bunch of drunk dudes, 7 days drunk. Now, I've got 2 women, I think, today on the broadcast. Where's Ron and Linda? There's Ron and Linda. Ron, take yourself off mute. Can you do that for me for a second? I'm going to ask Linda a question.
Okay.
Linda, does
Yeah.
that sound appetizing if you were Queen Vashti?
No,
Nope. Donna, you can just shake your head yes or no, but does that sound appealing to you? Marv has been drinking with a bunch of his bowling buddies for 7 days, is loaded up on his keister, and they're all bragging about their women. And he says, Donna, put on that little negligee you bought at Victoria's Secret and come in here and parade yourself in front of my friends and show them that I got the prettiest wife of them all. Does that appeal to you? No. Talk about a boneheaded level, stupid, drunken decision, but this is what he did. And this is what history records. Let's move on to verse 12. But Queen Vashti, who apparently had some noodles up here, Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger, this is pretty severe, burned within him. Now, Vashti was not by any means, Vashti was a pagan, but she was not a follower of the true God, but she had enough intelligence and smarts and wisdom and modesty to know this was something that she should not do. Persian women's modesty of Persia, this was where the veil came from. Women were not to flaunt themselves in public, only to their husbands. Persian modesty required them to be veiled in public. So even according to their own customs, this was an immoral request. And for the king to make it of the most high member of the female, ranking member of the females of their society to come do this was absolutely degrading. So she says, I'm not going to do it. And basically tells the eunuchs, go back and tell Ahasuerus to pack sand. I'm not going to do it. Now, we don't know the other reasons behind this because the text is silent, but many scholars have studied this and conjectured that she may have actually been pregnant at the time with Artaxerxes. So it's like, I'm not going to do this. I mean, we can all get that, right? We can all understand her reaction. However, we need to peel back some cultural layers of the onion because it's different for them than it was for us. The king's furious and his anger burned within him. Queen Vashti has now put herself in a very dangerous position. She's not only refused her husband, which according to their customs, the husband ruled the roost. I mean, you have to understand in many of the ancient societies, women were barely more than just chattel, property. Now the Hebrews started to change that. And one of the reasons we're spending time in Ruth and Esther, they named Bible books after them, including them in the canon of scripture. But for most ancient civilization, the women weren't, if your husband said to do something, you had to do it. But not only did she refuse her husband, she refused the king. And this guy's kind of a nut job. I'll read you some stuff about him in just a minute. But he's ticked because he's placed himself in a really stupid position because he's done this in front of all of his friends and all of his government officials. And she's now publicly said, not going to happen. So he's embarrassed. He's mortified. Now, how could he, let me ask you this. He put himself in this position, but how can he be expected to drum up support from 127 government officials and the people of Susa when he can't even control his own wife? Now, again, we don't think like that, but they would think like this. So do you understand how serious this is for Vashti? She did something very wise, but it was very dangerous for herself personally. So let's move on and finish verse 13 through 22. I should be able to at least read this, and then we may take a break and come back for the explanation. Then the king said, remember, he is really royally ticked. The king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. This is the text's footnote, not mine. What shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her this day by the eunuchs. And Memucan answered before the king and before all the other princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in all the provinces. She has basically offended everybody, King Ahasuerus, for the queen's behavior will become known to all women so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report that King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. So, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the law of the Persians and of the Medes, so that it will not be altered, emphasis added, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. Notice the message says nothing about Queen Vashti's rebellion. He doesn't want to put that out there. He just makes this decree to reiterate the man rules the roost, right? And they had a very well-developed postal system. They would use riders, and they could actually dispatch messages very effectively to all 127 provinces. So what do I got? 5 minutes. Let me break some of this down. These men who understood the times, and it lists the 7 men, these are not eunuchs. These are the princes of Persia. What they are is court astrologers and magicians, and they're actually mentioned somewhere else in our Bible. They would give advice to the king when he comes upon a sticky wicket like he's in now, because they would say that they could predict the future. They could see into the future. So these astrologers and magicians would pretend to be connected to the supernatural, and they would give the king advice. The Jewish prophets talked about these guys, and they made fun of them as charlatans, and would deride them and give them scorn. You can see some of that in Isaiah 44. So these 7 counselors of Ahasuerus are probably the same one that are mentioned in Ezra, these 7 specific guys. So one of these cats, Memucan, he recommends, hey, let's not mention Vashti, but because of the ripple effect of this, if this gets out, king, and you don't do anything about Vashti, then this is going to spread like wildfire. And I love J. Vernon McGee. Now, of course, the text is silent, and this is just his opinion, guys. He thinks Memucan was probably a henpecked husband and was looking for a reason to come up with a law that enforces men's authority in the home. But Memucan comes up with this rule, and it really pleases the king's ears. And it also means 2 other things. He was CYA, and I think we all know what that means in the Greek language. But basically, this guy was afraid if Vashti ever came back into power in the future, then she would have well within her ability and her power to take retribution on these 7 guys who passed this law about banishing her or punishing her. So by banishing her and making it permanent, she's never going to ever be back in a position of power to take retribution against Memucan and these other 6 guys. So they go ahead and they pass this law. Now, I've got 3 minutes left, so that's enough time to bid you adieu. If you guys could hop back on in maybe 1 or 2 minutes. I only have about a half a page left, and it's mainly your main message. So we will definitely finish early today. And I will see you back here in just about 60 to 90 seconds.